Hi there, good afternoon. Welcome to Succession Retirement Planning, What to Do with Your Premises. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come and listen to us today. So my name's Will Ellis. I work for a company called BW Healthcare Surveyors, and I'm going to be talking through what your options are on kind of retirement when it comes to your premises. And I'm also joined by Victoria Walker and Sarah Cook from Porter Dodson Solicitors, and they're going to be talking about kind of the legal mechanisms around premises, as well as partnership agreements when it comes to retirement and exit planning. And then finally, last but not least, we have Sarah Edwards from Albert Goodman talking about the kind of financial and tax implications to consider when you're going through the process. Okay, let's get started. We've got quite a lot to get through, so we will try and get through as much as we can. It's going to run for about an hour. We will hopefully have time at the end to have a bit of a Q&A. So if you've got any questions or queries, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box at the top. So there is a chat box and there's a Q&A. If you can put it in the Q&A, it just makes it a little bit easier. But either or, and then we'll go through any questions that might arise at the end and hopefully answer any queries that you may have. Okay, so my bit, what am I going to be talking about? I'm going to be talking about what to do with your premises upon retirement. So if you're a GP partner nearing retirement, or you're in a practice where GP partners are nearing retirement, what are your options when it comes to succession and retirement planning? So I think the first option and the best option really for most practices is just simply try and replace that exiting GP partner, which is the first port of call for most practices. You've got a partner leaving, just get somebody else, a salaried GP or a locum GP, to come in and promote them to partner, to replace the exiting partner. The issue is, and the issue is with a lot of practices that we speak to, is there doesn't seem to be that many GPs jumping at the chance to become partners these days for whatever reason. And if that is a difficulty of your practice, I think it's a bigger issue for rural practices rather than inner city practices. But if you're in a practice where you're just struggling to recruit GP partners, you've got a few partners nearing retirement, you do have some alternative options that might assist with the process. One of those is sale and leaseback, and I'll be talking about the pros and the cons of sale and leaseback in a moment or two, and how that works. And then another option is putting a lease in place. So rather than selling the premises, the exiting partners would retain ownership and become landlords themselves. And again, I'll be talking about the process and how that looks in a moment or two as well. And then another couple of options, one being a positive option, which is merging with another local practice. So perhaps you're running out of partners, but you've got a local practice with partners coming out of their eyeballs, and you can join in with them and merge effectively, or they could acquire your practice. There's a lot of that going on with into PCN mergers at the moment. So again, speaking to your local PCN or your local practices and talking about the possibility of a merger is certainly an option. And then the last option, which nobody really wants to think about, is certainly something we want to try and avoid, is closing the surgery and selling the premises. It can have some negative impacts on the value of the premises when you convert the surgery to an alternative use. But obviously, it's going to disrupt the patients, disrupt the local community and things. So it's not really anything we want to think about. And it's one of the main reasons why we've come together and put this webinar together is hopefully to try and find solutions so you don't have to go through that process of closing the surgery and getting all the patients to be registered to other practices and things. Okay, so one of the options I want to talk to in a bit more detail is sale and leaseback. So sale and leaseback, for those who don't know, is effectively if you own a practice, you hold the contract. Sale and leaseback would be you'd be selling the premises. You'd still retain the contract, you'd still provide medical services from the building, but you'd become tenants rather than owners of the premises. You'd sell the surgery to an investor. That investor would come in, purchase the practice, put a lease in place, which tends to be 10, 15, 20 years of length. And then they would become your landlords and you would pay rent to them directly. Now, some of the benefits of sale and leaseback, some of the things you need to be aware of, is that rent that you're paying the landlord should be fully reimbursed by the NHS. So there should hopefully be clauses in the lease when you go through the process that you are protected. So there was a clause, for example, that will say that the rent cannot exceed what you are getting reimbursed. So whatever you pay the landlord should get fully reimbursed by the NHS. It isn't always the case, to be honest with you. We have a lot of clients where they don't have such clauses. I would say the main reason for that is because they probably haven't used specialist solicitors or specialist surveyors to assist them through the process. So if you're going through a sale and leaseback process, or just putting a lease in place in general, always make sure that you use somebody specialist to assist you through the process to make sure you have all the necessary protections in there. Okay, so sale and leaseback can also reduce the perceived risk and responsibility of property ownership. So at the moment, if you're in an owner-occupied premises, you are responsible for everything, all the repairs, all the maintenance, all the upgrades, all the improvements. It falls on you as the owner of the premises. When you go through a sale and leaseback, there's the potential that the landlord will take on some of those responsibilities. They'll certainly be responsible for the upgrades and improvements and any extensions that you might need, but they may also be responsible for some of the repairs and maintenance. So, for example, the external repair and maintenance would normally fall on the landlords as a landlord responsibility. So they may take on that responsibility. What we tend to find when we take practices through sale and leaseback is the landlords don't want that responsibility either. And what they often do is they will back that back to the tenants, and they will ask the tenants to be responsible still for all repairs and maintenance that's needed. But if that is the case, then you should be retaining a proportion of the rent that you pay the landlord. So you'll receive a rent from the NHS. You'd normally just pay that in full to the landlord. But if you're responsible for what effectively the landlord should be responsible for, then you can retain somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of the rent. And the idea is you put that into a sinking fund and you use that money to pay for any repairs and maintenance. So either A, the landlord's going to take on the responsibility of the external repair, you don't have to worry about it, or B, you're still responsible for it, but you should have that money in the sinking fund to cover the costs of any repairs and maintenance that's needed. It can also help attract new GP partners, sale and leaseback. So I think one of the biggest issues with recruiting GP partners is the cost of it when you're in an owner-occupied premises, the cost and the liabilities of owning practices. GP partners perhaps don't want to get into hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of debt for a share of ownership of the premises. And we do find that practices in leasehold premises do find it a little bit easier to recruit GP partners. It's certainly not a magic wand. And you're not going to have GPs knocking at your door, begging to becoming a partner just because you become a leasehold premises, but it does make it a little bit easier. And the other thing, it can also assist with improvement works and extensions. So if you're in a practice that's in need of upgrades and improvements, but you're struggling to find funds, you can't fund it yourself, you're struggling to get grant money from the NHS, going through a sale and leaseback could be a solution, because you may be able to find an investor who's not just willing to buy the premises, but they're willing to upgrade and improve the premises as part of that process as well. And then the last thing is, in most cases, the tenant will have protected rights at the end of the lease. So under the Landlord and Tenants Act, you should have an automatic right to renew the lease once it expires. So one of the biggest issues that we have from clients is they're worried when they go through a sale and leaseback that they'll sign a lease, the lease expires, and the landlord will just kick them out and get a new tenant in. But you should have protected rights on the lease that says you can automatically renew the lease, and it just makes it very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult for the landlord to just kick you out and get somebody else in. Okay, so there are some of the upsides. To counter that as some of the downsides of sale and leaseback, or certainly some of the things you'd need to consider if you're thinking about going through the process. So leases can restrict what tenants do to the surgery. So yes, it is now the landlord's responsibility to upgrade and improve the surgery and potentially extend the surgery, but equally they're under no obligation to do that. If they don't want to do that, they don't have to. It's now their responsibility. It's up to them whether they want to spend the money in upgrading the surgery. So you have an extra layer of approvals now. Yes, you still need to get approval from the ICB and the NHS for your upgrades and improvements, but when you're in a leasehold premises, you also need to get approval from the landlord as well. And there may be specific obligations on the practice within the lease. So we've seen it where leases perhaps will ask you to redecorate the surgery every 3 to 5 years. There'll certainly be a clause in the lease that asks you to keep the surgery in its current state of repair. So you will be asked to keep whatever the state of repair is on day one of the lease, has to be the state of repair at the end of the lease. Otherwise, you could have financial penalties at the end of the lease, effectively to bring the surgery back up to its original state. And there's going to be liabilities under the lease as well, including rental payments. So yes, the NHS will fully reimburse you for the rent you're paying the landlord, but that is only on the proviso that you continue to provide medical services and you hold a GMS contract. If for whatever reason that were to stop, let's say you signed a 15-year lease under a sale and leaseback, and then all the GPs fell out with each other, all wanted to leave, all wanted to hand the contract back, but you still have this premises that you have 5 years left to run on the lease. And if you're not providing medical services, you as individual GPs or the individual GPs of the GP partners of the premises are going to be liable for those rental payments. So it's just making sure when you go through a sale and leaseback, you don't sign a lease that's too long that you perhaps don't have the capability of honouring. And then there's also an issue with most investors requiring 2 signatories on the lease. So if you are a single-handed GP partner, you're probably going to struggle to go through sale and leaseback. You're probably going to need to bring somebody else in because it's too much of a liability from an investor point of view, paying all that money for practice for there just to be 1 signature on the lease. Because if anything were to happen to that GP, then they're obviously going to struggle to provide medical services, and there's going to be issues with rents and things. So the majority of investors will require a minimum of 2. The more the merrier, basically. And then there's issues with early redemption penalties and potential tax implications as well, which I think Sarah's going to talk briefly on both of those aspects during her presentation. Okay, so that's sale and leaseback, the ups and the downs. As an alternative to that, so perhaps you don't want to sell the premises when you retire, you don't want to sell it to an investor, you want to keep hold of that investment, then you could consider putting a lease in place instead. So rather than you selling your share to an incoming GP partner, or rather than all the partnerships selling their share, they're selling the premises to an investor, as a partnership, you could just retain ownership when you retire. As a GP partner, you could retire, retain ownership, and actually just put a lease in place yourselves, become the landlords yourselves. So then when you've got a GP partner leaving, they'll just come off the contract, but they still retain ownership of the premises. And that's great as well, because it gives you the flexibility when you've got an incoming partner coming in. They can either buy into the partnership and be an equity owning partner, or they can just hold the contract and be a non-equity owning partner. So it does give you a little bit of flexibility there as well. But some things to consider when you're putting a lease in place: always make sure it's an NHS GP surgery lease. They are very, very unique. Unlike it just being between landlord and tenant, the NHS play quite a significant role in things like the rent reviews and the lease renewals, and that needs to be stipulated into the lease. So very, very important to have a specific lease. Very, very important that lease is approved by the NHS. It can cause a whole host of issues if you've not got an approved lease. It'll cause issues with rent reviews, and it can actually cause issues with applying for funding and grant money from the ICB. Quite often in the funding agreements, you have to have an approved lease to be eligible for funding and grant money from the ICB. So very, very important you have an NHS GP surgery lease and that it's approved. You need to clearly state your landlord and tenant's responsibilities, so who's going to be responsible for what if anything goes wrong. And check conditions of your mortgage as well. There may be restrictions on the mortgage that says you have to retain and remain as an owner-occupied premises. And then when you sell the premises, or when you put a lease in place, you're no longer an owner-occupied premises, it's a leasehold premises, and you may not be eligible. There may be restrictions on the mortgage. So always speak to your mortgage provider from that respect as well. And there's going to be potential tax implications for putting the lease in place, as there is for absolutely everything these days. Okay, so that is sale and leaseback. That is putting a lease in place. One final thing that I want to talk about, and I have about 2 minutes of my time slot to go, so I will try and race through this last slide. It's just a little bonus one, really, about how to maximize the value of the premises. So if you're in an owner-occupied premises, in terms of maximizing the value of the premises, the best way to do that really is by increasing the rental income. If you can increase the rental income even by just £1,000 a year, it can increase the capital value of the premises by £10,000, £15,000. It can have a huge knock-on effect to the capital value. And one of the best ways to increase the rental income, and therefore the capital value, is by challenging your notional rent assessment. So you'll have a notional rent assessment every 3 years. That'll be assessed by the district valuer. Never just take their opinion as fact. Always get a second opinion, speak to a surveyor, get them to run the numbers, just make sure that the assessment that the district valuer has done is correct and in line with the current market. That is a big one, and I would recommend doing that every 3 years. The majority of the surveyors in the sector, and we certainly do this, we'll offer you a free initial assessment anyway. So there's no harm in going through that process, because if you're not underfunded, you don't pay anything. So certainly that is a big one. And then other things, if you lease space out, so perhaps you've got a pharmacy, you rented space to a pharmacy, or a dentist or a chiropractor, whatever it may be, district nurses, make sure you've got a lease in place first. So make sure that rental income is secured with ideally a long-term lease in place. The longer the lease, the better from a value point of view. And then if you already have leases in place, just make sure that you're instigating those rent reviews and really maximizing the rent that you're charging those tenants. And then a couple more things. So make the most of any spare space, which most practices find hilarious because I don't think anybody's got any spare space at the moment. But if you manage to magic some spare space from somewhere, just try and make the most of it, especially if you've got any non-reimbursable areas. So perhaps you used to rent out to a pharmacy or a dentist and they're now vacated and you've just got vacant space in the premises. Well, you're not going to be receiving notional rent for that space unless you ask for it. So it might be worthwhile making an application to the ICB to try and seek approval of that space, or maybe just look at getting another tenant in. And then the last thing is upgrades and improvements and extensions. If you're modernising the surgery, if you're upgrading the surgery, and especially if you're making extensions to the surgery, it's going to increase the rental income as long as you get approval from the NHS. That is so important. Don't just assume because you're building an extension or upgrading and improving the surgery that the NHS are automatically going to pay you more notional rent. It's not how it works. If you're making changes, you need to get approval for those changes, but you also need to get approval for reimbursement of those changes as well. So a two-leveled improvement to the ICB for that. And that is me. There we go, exactly 15 minutes or just over. So I will now pass you on to Victoria Walker, who I believe is going to be talking you through the legal mechanisms around premises. So yes, there we go. I will leave you all to it. All yours, Victoria.
I'm with you. Thanks, Will. So, legal premises issues, timing matters. When a GP retires, property issues are rarely top of the list. Understandably, the focus is often on staffing, managing patient communications and expectations and contract changes. But the property issues don't wait politely in the background. If the property ownership situation is not dealt with promptly, it can become problematic and more expensive later on. We commonly see title deeds that have not been updated for years, retired partners still registered as owners at the land registry, and difficulties getting documents signed once those partners have disengaged from the practice. Several real-life examples highlight the difficulties that can arise when retired partners are required to participate in property transactions. In one instance, the process had to be coordinated whilst a retired partner was on a plane to Nova Scotia. And in another case, a retired partner was unreachable as she was ascending Machu Picchu. But perhaps the most challenging situation I think we've seen involved a transaction subject to probate after a retired partner had passed away. Unexpectedly, the executor responsible for the administration of the estate also passed away during the transaction, introducing additional complexities and delays. Now, although these scenarios may seem exceptional, our experience shows that these occurrences are not unusual. These factors almost always surface at the worst possible time. For example, when the bank applies pressure to regularise their security, or because the practice is keen to bring in a new partner. This can introduce tight timescales, putting pressure on already stretched practice managers. I think the key message here is that these problems can be avoided if the property work starts before the retirement actually happens. So key steps, looking at freehold property first. Step one is simple, but it's often overlooked. Review the title deeds to confirm who the current legal owners actually are. This should ideally be done as soon as the retirement is announced. Up-to-date information can be obtained direct from the land registry. It's not expensive. Keep in mind that copies held at the practice can sometimes be out of date and should not necessarily be relied on. You should also check the partnership agreement to understand how valuation should be dealt with, timing, mechanics for those, in order to pay the equity partners out. If there is a mortgage secured on the property, it's important to speak to your bank early. I think the message here is early conversations equal fewer surprises later. In practice, the bank's requirements are often the biggest driver of both timing and cost. Some banks have relatively straightforward processes for retirement. They only require a deed of variation to remove the retiring partner. Other lenders can be less straightforward. They require multiple documents, and sometimes if there's an incoming partner, a whole new mortgage deed might be necessary. Where a new mortgage deed is necessary, the bank will usually instruct us to undertake due diligence and provide a certificate of title. This can involve searches and inquiries, which inevitably increases time spent and costs involved. In some cases, this can also trigger new lending terms and arrangement fees. It's also worth noting that some lenders wish to instruct their own solicitor to act for them independently of your firm, and you will be expected to pay their fees too. So a quick look at leasehold property. The starting point is the lease itself. In particular, you need to check the assignment provisions. These are sometimes called the alienation provisions, to see whether landlord's consent is required for a change in partners or whether the simple notification is sufficient. Even where notification is all that is required, leases can be prescriptive about how such notices must be served. So legal advice is still recommended here. If landlord's consent is required, this is usually documented in a license to assign, and the landlord may wish to impose conditions, which you should seek advice on. Practices can be required to pay the landlord's legal and surveyor fees in addition to their own. Delays are common. These transactions are rarely a high priority for your landlord or their solicitor. You may need to invest some time in pushing the transaction through by proactively chasing your landlord. If you can do this, it often reduces delay and saves on legal fees. So finally, just a few practical considerations around former partners. Without intending it, retired partners can become the biggest cause of delay in a property transaction. Once retired, they may be difficult to contact, travelling, or just less responsive with other priorities. This can delay the signing of documents. We've seen examples of retired partners forgetting this is something that needs to be dealt with and refusing to cooperate. This can also sometimes lead to the practice being asked to pay for the retired partner's legal advice for then dealing with the necessary property documentation. They will also be required to produce ID to satisfy land registry requirements for registering the transfer deed to change the legal ownership. Again, this can cause delays if not anticipated. Where possible, documentation should be prepared and signed whilst the retiring partners are still engaged with the practice. Subject to cooperation from your bank, signed documents could be held by your solicitor and dated on retirement. This small step can significantly reduce the pressure on practice managers and help keep the process on track. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Sarah Cook.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Sarah. I was just going to say thank you ever so much for that, Victoria. And just while you're getting your slides up, Sarah, I just thought I'd remind everyone there is a Q&A section on there. So if you do have any specific questions about your circumstances, your situation, or if you want to know anything at all about what we discussed, please put it in that Q&A and we can cover that at the end. There we go. Sorry, all yours, Sarah. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Brilliant. So you've heard about the various premises options that you might have on retirement, and you've also now heard about the legal mechanics of those options. So what I want to focus on now is how all of that actually works when a GP partner retires. So premises decisions do not work in isolation. In practice, the success and failure of those plans comes down to one document, and that is the partnership agreement. So they only work, those decisions, if the partnership framework allows you to leave cleanly. The agreement will govern how you exit, and without that framework in place, retirement can actually become more of a negotiation at exactly the wrong time. So what are your retirement routes? Most GP partners will retire in one of these three ways. Some will fully retire and leave the partnership altogether. Others will use 24-hour retirement to access their NHS pension and then return. And increasingly, many are choosing partial retirement, which is reducing sessions while continuing to work. So from a partnership perspective, these routes are very different. And the key point is that your partnership agreement needs to allow you to take the route that you're planning to take. So most of the partnership agreements I've looked at recently have not contained partial retirement at all as an option. That's understandable. It's a relatively new option. But what's more surprising is often 24-hour retirement isn't properly dealt with either, or even if it is mentioned, it doesn't contain the correct provisions covering the right of the partner to retire, i.e. leave the partnership and then return to practice. So what that means is there's no automatic right for them to be readmitted to the partnership at all under their pre-retirement terms. But don't panic. The good news is actually a relatively easy fix for you. It can often be dealt with via a simple deed of variation to vary the terms of your partnership agreement rather than having to go through a full rewrite or anything like that. It's something we regularly help practices with, and it's generally a modest piece of work that can add significant value and flexibility to your partnership. So check if your agreement allows you to take the option you're planning to take. Again, because otherwise it becomes a bit more, again, a negotiation, which you obviously want to avoid. Right. Capital, premise, and exit pressure points. This is where retirements most often run into difficulty. So retiring doesn't just simply mean stopping work. It usually means getting money out and being released from risk. So the partnership agreement should spell out when capital is to be repaid, how premises interests are to be dealt with, and the liabilities, particularly under leases or bank lending, are actually released. You've also got to consider the continuity of the GMS contract. I often deal with partnership disputes, and quite often these do occur on retirement. And more often than not, it's because either the partnership agreement is not clear on what should happen at retirement, or it is clear, but the steps that are set out in the agreement have not been followed. So common issues include when evaluation should take place, how it's done, which surveyor should they appoint, and what happens if the partners can't agree. And if those points aren't nailed down, disputes can escalate very, very quickly. I've actually got an ongoing matter at the moment where the valuation on exit was a huge drop, massively significant drop. And the process, which was set out in the partnership agreement for appointing a valuer and having the valuation take place, is not followed. And it has led to a dispute. As you can imagine, it's very stressful. No one knows where they stand, and it can soon become extremely costly. It's a very common risk, and it's one that's entirely avoidable. Other things to think about things like interest. So say if you have got a freehold property and you're being bought out, what happens if they can't do it within the timescale set out within the agreement? It's just something to think about, and another example of where small drafting points in your partnership agreement can actually have a big financial impact. If the documents aren't clear, partnership exits just create unnecessary risk for everybody involved. Right, my favourite point, what to do if there is no or an outdated partnership agreement. If there's no written partnership agreement in place, or say, for example, you've had new partners join the partnership since your partnership agreement was written, and they haven't perhaps signed up to the agreement, or it's just simply hugely outdated, you are very much at risk of being what's known as a partnership at will. What this means is you're governed by the very, very ancient Partnership Act, and within this act, there is no real concept of retirement. If a partner leaves the partnership dissolves. So you don't want to have that. And it is absolutely vital that you check you've got a valid partnership agreement in place. So please check your agreement, or if you're unsure and you don't know whether your agreement is valid, then get in touch. We can review your agreement to flag if there are any issues you need to worry about. So what to do next if you are thinking about retiring, which I assume a lot of you are because you're on this call. What should you do in practice? If you're quite far out, so say perhaps 3 to 5 years away, now is the time to review your partnership agreement. Make sure it deals properly with capital, with premises, and the various different retirement routes that you're considering. If it's happening, say within the next year, think about your notice periods that you have to give. Make sure the premises decisions align with how you're planning to retire. And then finally, if you're imminently about to retire, then again, please check your agreement and don't panic if it's not quite right, because what you can do is put in place a carefully drafted deed of retirement, documenting your exits and hopefully avoiding disputes and protecting the practice and yourself going forward. I'll leave you a question before I move on to think about. If you gave notice to retire tomorrow, do you know exactly how and when your capital would be repaid to you? Okay, so the partnership agreement sets the framework for how you exit, and the next piece of the jigsaw is obviously what those choices mean in financial terms. So I'm going to pass you over to Sarah Edwards to cover that next.
Well, seamlessly passing over. Thank you, Sarah. Let me see if I can seamlessly share my slides. That will be jolly helpful. 2 seconds. Present in Teams, fingers crossed. Present. Wonderful. So my name is Sarah Edwards. I'm a specialist GP accountant at Albert Goodman, predominantly in the Southwest. And I'm just going to seamlessly slide on from Will, Victoria and Sarah and talk about the financial implications of your premises choices on retirement. So I'm going to pack a lot in on purpose. I'm sorry if I'm talking fast. You will get a recording, so you can always play me back in half speed if you've missed anything that you really want to go back and have a read over. So I'm going to talk you through the 3 key choices that Will sort of introduced at the beginning in terms of retaining the freehold within the partnership, sale and leaseback, and a retiring partner keeping their share of the property, and then a summary of the financial impact then on the retiring partner and the continuing partners. So retaining the freehold within the partnership group. So either you've got a new partner coming in who's going to buy the share of the outgoing partner, or you don't have a new partner either by choice or you've struggled to bring somebody in, and the collectively continuing partners will buy out that exiting partner. So the things that you need to think about: evaluation, speaking to a surveyor. What does your partnership agreement say about, does there automatically have to be evaluation? Is it at the discretion of the continuing partners? Is it the exiting partner who bears the cost of that valuation? It might be split, it might be exiting partner, could be all sorts. And also, as Sarah just said, what happens if there's a dispute? So probably for the first time, certainly in my career in medical, we have started to see even if your notional rent has gone up, we have seen some property values coming down with sort of a shift in the market, the return on investment requirements changing. So if you've got a valuation between sort of 2019, 2021, 22, and you've got a new one now, you might find that your property valuation has come down slightly. That's obviously a hot topic for dispute when you've got a partner retiring. And also, what can have an even more significant impact is if you've had, say, a pharmacy pull out. Again, we know Boots, Lloyds, for example, have been pulling out over the last little while. And more recently, certainly in our region, Jahoots have got themselves into all sorts of trouble. And the loss of that income can really reduce the valuation of the property. So knowing what your partnership agreement says on what the valuation of the property needs to be, do you need a valuation? All of those things are really important for the continuing partners buying out the retiring partner and the retiring partner to know what you're going to receive on the in retirement. And the other part then to take into account of what you'll receive or pay out in terms of the property value is what level you'll have your share of the property value less your share of the loans, and that's your property equity that either the continuing partners or a new partner will have to buy in. So again, understanding that, checking on your property capital account in your accounts should clearly set that out. So how is it going to be funded? So you've got options. It might be if you've only got a small amount of equity that you don't need any external finance, you might be able to fund that through your profits that you might not draw out. Alternatively, you might need a new partnership loan, you might take personal loans, or you might refinance existing debt, whether that's in the partnership or outside. And a key thing on that when it comes to how do you finance it is looking at the timing of those payments. What does your partnership agreement say about the timing of those payments? Some of them are extremely quick, and they've got to be paid out very quickly, within months, weeks of the retirement date. Others you have 12 months after approval of accounts. So, you're talking from 4 weeks to probably, well over 12 months. Can vary enormously. And then more for the continuing partners, what is the financial impact of those new finance loans? What is the interest rate? What are the capital repayments? What impact does that have on your cash, on your drawings, on your tax, on your pension? Checking all of those things if you're looking at financing that buyout. And reviewing your covenants. So particularly if you're looking at new finance or changes within the partner group, making sure you've let the bank know, they know of the changes, and any new finance, some have got some not healthcare, not primary care specific covenants, which make it incredibly difficult to meet them, or very ambiguous as to whether you've met them or not. So check your covenants in your bank agreements. Liabilities, I think have been touched on in terms of the partnership agreement for the continuing and the outgoing partners. What is the liability in terms of what do you retain, what might you still be liable for, and what do you pass on? And making sure then in terms of, are there property issues ongoing? Are there maintenance provisions? Do you know if you've been contributing to that and it's unspent? Do you know if that's coming back to you, or is it lost? Is it your share of the maintenance provision over that time? And all of that again should be detailed in your partnership agreement. So incredibly important that that's what you check to know what you're taking on and what you'll receive on retirement. So in terms of tax, for your retiring partner, you're selling your share of the property. So you're looking at a capital gains tax transaction, whereby your value that you're selling it at now is compared to the cost that you bought it at, or multiple costs as you've bought out other partners as you go along. And then that gain, that difference, is subject to capital gains tax. Usually, if you're exiting the partnership, you're likely to qualify for business asset disposal relief, but it's not guaranteed. You need to make sure you've hit all the criteria. So you might pay 14% up to April, and then 18% beyond the 6th of April for capital gains tax if you qualify for business asset disposal relief. So knowing what your original cost was and and the value of the property, and that difference, knowing what your tax liability is going to be and what you need to pay out from any funds that you do receive from your capital account. Stamp duty, usually not an issue if the property is being retained within the partnership, but it's not a given. So do make sure that you check with solicitor, accountant to make sure that there's no curveballs in there. But generally, if it's remaining within the partnership group, you should be okay. And income tax, not huge amounts of impact there, but if you're looking at a refinance, are there any early settlement charges? If you've got a change in loan composition between interest and capital, that can affect the cash flow, your tax relief, your pension. So worth looking at that, any arrangement fees, etc. So it can have an impact on your income tax as well. So next option is sale and leaseback. If you're looking at a sale and leaseback, what do you need to think about? So first of all, you're usually selling to a GP practice investor. You've got your big boys, your CHP, your assurer, could be a council, for example, if you're in new premises. How much will you receive? So what are they going to pay you for that property? And then you're leasing that property back from them. So what are the terms of that lease? And you want to go over that with a fine-tooth comb to know what your liabilities are. What sort of lease is it? What are your responsibilities? Is it external repairs, internal repairs? what dilapidations provisions might you need to have in, because you would need to keep the property in the state of repair that you take it on. And what level of investment might you have in the property. So Will talked about this at the beginning. It can often be that it's expected then that will bring a level of investment that you might not be able to afford as a partner group as you are. It's not always the case, so make sure you go over the terms of the lease, and also consider any restrictions on what you can do with the property. So if you're looking at increasing clinical space by converting rooms, is that something you can do? What permissions do you need to get from the landlord within that agreement? Make sure you agree the reimbursement with the ICB, and again, model the financial impact of that new arrangement. So you're no longer getting your notional rent and paying your interest and your capital repayments. You now got a rent cost that you should be able to get reimbursed from the ICB, but you'll also likely have service agreements. What are the costs within that? Are you tied to use the landlord? What are your dispute resolution clauses in the lease agreement if they're charging you £5 for a light bulb? And dilapidation provisions. Consider making sure that as you go along, you're providing for a cost of keeping the property up to date and in the state of repair that you took it on, rather than waiting 10-15 years down the line, not doing too much to it, and then the partners at that time are having a huge amount of costs attached to bringing the property back up to where it was when you took it on. Tax. So sale and leaseback, you do need to be careful. So in terms of a capital gains tax position, you're selling your share of the property, all of the partners, so you'll all crystallise your capital gains tax liability. So from the cost when you bought it to the valuation now that you're being paid for it, you'll have capital gains tax on that difference. And stamp duty is, you need to be ultra careful with in terms of a sale and leaseback, particularly if it's a retirement scenario. So that there are reliefs available for stamp duty on a sale and leaseback, but where you've got different partners continuing with the lease than are selling the property, then those might not always apply. So you need to be careful if you're doing a sale and leaseback in that scenario, in that you could end up paying stamp duty on the lease, the value of the lease that you're buying back, if you like. And then if you're in a sale and leaseback scenario, you've got an ongoing lease, lease renewals are subject to stamp duty as well. So bearing that in mind when you're looking at the cost benefit scenario of your sale and leaseback option. So the other option that Will introduced is the retired partner keeps their share of the property and ends up acts as an investor. So you in that scenario, you've got one partner, a non-partner who's a property owner, and they would then expect to receive an income from their share of the property. So you'd be paying that share to them. You also then need to consider what share of costs might they incur. So you might need a lease, you might not need a lease. Again, you would speak to your solicitor about that. But what share of costs would you expect them to share in? You've almost got your sort of landlord-tenant sort of scenario in that they wouldn't be expected to share in the costs of the upkeep and running of the practice of the building, but you have your landlord costs, you would likely expect them to share in potentially. And make sure, again, you update your partnership agreement. What are the property shares? How does that work, so that everyone's very clear on those who owns what and who's sharing in what. It can bring a number of challenges, again, which has been touched on, Sarah mentioned already, in terms of you've got different, your interests might not be aligned anymore. You've got a different set of priorities. You've got the partners continuing in the practice who might want to do one thing, and you've got retired partner who might want to do something else. So there's, again, potentially room for disagreement there and different interests. And simple things like getting signatures, which again, sort of Victoria touched on, is things can be delayed where you've got a retired partner who's not in the business every day. You know, they're not around, as simple as that, and hard to get signatures from. Be careful of bank agreements, making sure you're letting the bank know. You could be in breach of those if you don't let them know. And consider how that works with if you have a new partner coming in a year or two's time. How does that work? Who's in control of how long that partner retains that share? And if the new partner's coming in, can they buy that off of the exiting partner, or would they continue to own that share? In terms of taxes, if the retired partner keeps that share, if the retired partner's point of view, if they keep their share of the property for too long, it's no longer that they're selling their business asset. So you might lose that lower business asset disposal relief capital gains tax rate of 14 or 18% past April, and you might be at your 24% capital gains tax rate, generally about 3 years. If you hold on to it for that long, you might lose that beneficial rate. And then from a stamp duty point of view, again, care needs to be taken because it's no longer the relief available for if the property is kept within a partnership and you've got partnership changes, there's reliefs available. If you've got a share of that property coming out of the partnership with a non partner, then potentially you could be in a scenario where you've got stamp duty payable on that share of the property going out of the partnership, payable by the retiring partner. And then when you buy it back, you're bringing it back into the partnership, potential stamp duty. So make sure you get specialist advice if you're looking at retired partner keeping that share, certainly for any length of time. Now, we know that highly unlikely that on retirement date the property is going to be all ready to go. You've got your signed agreements and it's all going to happen. It takes time. So we consider more around the intention of, is the intention for them to hold on to the property? And there's a sort of notional, it's not written down anywhere, but a notional 12 months sort of period where if it's the mechanics of it are being sorted out, then you could mostly you would say that there isn't stamp duty due, but you need to consider what the intention is and how long is that retiring partner going to hold on to that share. And consider if you're putting a lease in place, which especially if you've got more than one non-partner owning the property, you might want to consider. And then you've got your potential stamp duty implications on the cost of putting that lease in place. I'm like the speaker of doom. I do apologise. Stamp duty, stamp duty. So in terms of summarising the impact on the retiring partner. So as a retiring partner, I'm changing the wrong slide, sorry. In terms of the impact on the retiring partner, what do you need to consider? So what is your capital payment that you're going to be due on retirement? What's the valuation of the property? What's your share of the loan? And what's your property equity, therefore, that you're going to be paid out from the practice? And then once you know what that is, when are you going to receive that amount? Again, it can vary between a matter of weeks to significant amount of months. And again, if it goes on, what are the provisions in the partnership agreement for interest? It might be, again, that that's due very quickly, or it might be that if the payment date is in 9 months and it's not due, that interest kicks in if the practice is unable to pay you at that point in time. So what are you going to receive from the practice in terms of your premises? And then what are you going to have to pay out? So that capital gains tax liability, you're selling your share of the property. So you need to consider what value are you selling at now versus what cost you bought at, and that difference is what's subject to capital gains tax. If you're selling it within 3 years, then you're likely to benefit from the business asset disposal relief at 14%, 18% from April. And then consider when is that payable. So you need to consider when you're going to receive the cash from the practice, and then when are you going to have to pay that capital gains tax liability. So for commercial GP practices, that would just go on your tax return in the tax year that the transaction happens, and you would have to pay that liability by the January following the end of that tax year. So knowing what the cash flows are and the timing of them is really important. And again, if you're in certain scenarios, just checking, is there a stamp duty liability? Most cases there won't be, but do make sure you double check. And again, understanding your ongoing income and liability situation. So if you are holding on to the property for a little while, what income are you expected to receive? What deductions might the practice make from that? If you're still servicing a loan, for example, or you're contributing to the to external repairs, and what are your rights and obligations? Again, all detailed in the partnership agreement or a lease agreement. And then one thing I wanted to really highlight in terms of planning ahead points, because that's really a theme of today, whether it's from surveyor valuation, property mechanics, partnership agreement, is planning ahead so that you know what's going to happen. Be very careful if you have, if you've refinanced and you've released equity in the property, whilst you're an ongoing partner. If you're then looking at retirement, whether that's 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years out from that date, you've released all of the equity in the property. So you've been paid out your money, your equity in the property at that point in time. But at that point in time, you haven't paid any capital gains tax because you haven't sold the property. So on retirement, you might have a small amount of equity to be paid out from the practice, but you might have your whole capital gains tax liability, which if you bought in a long time ago, could be a significant tax liability. So again, making sure you understand what will you be due out on retirement and what capital gains tax might you have to pay from that. Because if you've refinanced and had your equity out, a few years before, then you need to understand what you might need to hold back from that for your capital gains tax when it does come to retirement. I've seen that catch a few people out, so you need to make sure you consider that. What are the implications and a summary of the impact on the continuing partners? So you need to consider the cash flow really ongoing for the continuing partners. How are you going to fund that retiring partner buying out? Does that mean obtaining extra finance? What is payable and when? Know when you've got to pay it by before you start paying any interest, and then consider how you're gonna fund that. And again, the further ahead you can plan for that, you can make informed decisions. You can look at, do I need to finance everything? You might not want to finance everything. You might be able to coincide with the ending of a current finance agreement, and you can look at refinancing without any early settlement payments. Planning ahead is key. What's the impact of any new finance? Are there settlement charges? What do the covenants look like? What's the impact on my profits and my cash? Making sure you understand the makeup of the loan in terms of capital and interest. Obviously, you get tax and pension relief on the interest element, not on the capital element. So you might have the same level of loan, but if it's got a different composition to it, it can really change the cash available for drawings, for example, and making sure you model that is important. If you're in a lease scenario, whether it's to the exiting partner or to if you've done a sale and leaseback, making sure you understand, again, modelling the impact of the finances from that and understanding what your tax liabilities are. And then if you do have non-property owning, non-partners owning property, making sure you're clear on what decisions you can make, who's in control of those decisions, and the risk of stamp duty potentially payable on that. And again, planning ahead point, something to be aware of is if you're in a scenario where you have a partner retiring and at that point in time you don't have another partner stepping up and coming in to buy that share, and you're collectively buying that partner out. But in a year's time, you've got a new partner that wants to come in and they want to buy that share of the property. The way that it works is you don't buy that share of property at X pounds and sell it to new partner at X pounds when they come in a year later. The valuation might be exactly the same, and you'd expect then, well, I bought it there and I sold it there, I don't have any capital gains tax liabilities. But what happens is you buying that share from that exiting partner all goes into the pot of your original base cost, and you can crystallize some of your capital gain from when you originally bought the property to the total value now. So just make sure, again, you're planning for that and you understand if you buy from an exiting partner and then sell to a new partner, you might end up crystallizing capital gains tax liabilities that you weren't anticipating. So if there's any way of mitigating that and doing those transactions together potentially, or at least understanding what those liabilities look like, you're in a better informed position to make those decisions. Key takeaways from all of us. The premises choices that you make really affect your retirement outcomes for the retiring partner and for the continuing partners. And early retirement, early planning affects, you understand what you're getting, you understand what your liabilities are, and it really avoids disputes and delays. Sorry. And whatever you decide to do, make sure you get the correct advice before you go ahead with it. Speak to a specialist. There's lots of nuances in primary care and GP premises that you need to speak to a specialist. A generalist will not understand. So do speak to a specialist before you're making those decisions. And then if you've got any questions, I'm just going to pop our contact details up on here. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact any of us. Our details are up on the screen.